Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back. I'm your host, Deanna Chapman, and today I am joined by Drew Dietsch, and we are not talking about an anthology series or short story collection this time, Drew.
I know, it's the rare, actual, real Stephen King book that you and I are discussing. I've not been a part of any of those episodes, and I gotta say, if there was one book that I could talk about for Stephen King, I would actually want it to be On Writing.
Yeah, this is one of those books that a lot of people talk about when they talk about people wanting to become writers and reading process books. And the only reason I didn't include the nonfiction stuff in the mix was because I kind of wanted to tackle it on its own. And King doesn't have a whole lot of nonfiction. He has this. I also have Dance Macabre and Secret Windows sitting on my shelf. And then his very odd gargoyle photo book with F. Stop Fitzgerald called Nightmares in the Sky.
I'm so fascinated by that.
I can't wait.
But yeah, no, I mean, he'll occasionally, write like an online essay or something like that, but he's not nearly as prolific with nonfiction writing than he is with fiction. And he talks about that in On Writing. He talks about why he's so attracted to fiction. This is interesting, because unlike any other Stephen King book, it's like we're not talking about plot or characters or mythology or anything like that. It really is hey, do you want to be a writer? Here's my advice. And I found that the book, I think it's actually broken into, it might be 4 parts because there's like weird addendums at the end.
Yeah.
But I looked at this, I read this way back, probably shortly after it was originally released, because I remember reading the hardcover version of it, which I might still have somewhere. But I looked at it and I was like, there's basically 3 parts of this book. One is the actual, hey, here's my advice on how to be a better writer and like what you need to do if you want to really pursue the craft of writing. That's like the big middle chunk of the book where it's actually on writing. The other part, which comes before that, is one of the closest things we've gotten to a just straightforward memoir autobiography from Stephen King.
I had forgotten about that a little bit because I too had read this. I actually won some random like Twitter giveaway or something, and they were giving away an ebook copy.
Okay.
And I read it at the time. It was, before I had started Chat Sematary, I'm pretty sure. But I remembered the on writing portion of it. And because I have a Kindle copy, they automatically update it. So it has since, gotten the 30-year anniversary edition or whatever it is. And there's like an interview with Joe Hill that, Joe conducts to talk to his dad. And it's literally just called Joe Hill, A Conversation with My Dad. So you have sort of these little extras in the Kindle copy, which I understand that there are people out there who love collecting every single physical edition of a book. But if you're someone who doesn't want to do that and wants to still get the updates, I really recommend the Kindle copy. And like you were saying, this isn't a long book. So you can kind of just revisit this one, I think, more frequently than a lot of his other books, frankly,
Oh, sure. I mean, because it's a guide. Like it's something that you don't need to read it all the way through every time. It's still quite good in that regard, but it's there as a tool. So the third part, which is kind of, I guess it depends on what version you read, because the version I had didn't have the Joe Hill conversation. That sounds cool, but the third part is kind of tied into the memoir element, but it's very specific. It's him detailing the events of the very famous, him being hit by a car, and him kind of really describing, it's like, this is everything I remember, how it happened, what went down, my recovery from it. And that certainly, I mean, he comes around to it being, it's like that I think he talks about, like, I debated putting this in the book, but really it had to be because it's like, writing is what's always been there for me. And it was a way for me to, get back on the horse. He says it's like within 5 weeks of me being hit by this car, I was writing again. Even though it brought him great physical pain. And so it's like those three elements, I think in some ways could be their own books.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a little surprising that he hasn't gone back and revisited this in particular because, like I was saying, I have a 30th anniversary edition, I believe, and he has expanded what he writes about so much since then. He's done the hard case crime books. He's done the Bill Hodges trilogy. He's tried a lot of new things even since this came out. So I think it would be cool to see him expand on it, whether it's a new edition of it or just if he keeps doing more essays. But there was a quote, and I'm pretty sure it was in the CV section, that kind of resonates a little more now that we've been stuck in a pandemic. And it's, writing is a lonely job. Having someone who believes in you makes a lot of difference. They don't have to make speeches. Just believing is usually enough. And I think with how many of us are now sitting by ourselves in a room doing most of our work, it's not something that just applies to writing now. And I read that and I was like, oof, that hit a little too close to home.
Well, sure. I mean, what I like about this book in a broader sense than just the, hey, here's Stephen King's tips, here's Stephen King's 6 tips for being a better writer kind of thing. It's like, no, him talking about writing is him talking about his viewpoint on life, because writing is his life. Like, so you get those elements weaved in, and King always knows how to tell a good story and create a good character. Like, it will be impossible for me to forget the real person, but the character in this book of Eula Beulah, his babysitter, who he talks about would sit on his face and rip huge farts. And it's like, that's so, like, I believe that really happened to Stephen King, but I'm like, man, that's such like a Stephen King thing, like of a character, because he's like, I can't remember if her name was Eula or Beulah. So then he just starts calling her Eula Beulah. And I'm like, that's such a Stephen King, idiosyncrasy for a character. So that kind of stuff I like. The memoir part of it, that's not about the accident, it is interesting, and it's certainly a cool peek into why, how Stephen King became who he was, and his pursuits and everything. But there was a part of me that was like, on this reread, my first reread of it, I was like, yeah, I just want to get to the on writing section, because that's the stuff I remember. Like the autobiography stuff hadn't stuck with me a whole lot over the years. Same. But there were things in the on writing section that's like, oh yeah, I didn't even know that I was kind of quoting Stephen King when I talk about this. So I gotta give the book a lot of credit for its staying power. And in regards to him possibly expanding it, cool. It's always good to get more Stephen King, but I like early in the book, he says, this is a short book because most books about writing are filled with bullshit. Yeah. Which I'm like, yeah. And that's, I think, part of his appeal as a writer in general is that he's a pretty no bullshit kind of guy, like in terms of his writing. And when he gets into his viewpoints on writing, it's very easy to see that that's his ethos, where he's like, don't be, an example is like his hatred of adverbs. It's like anything that can cut it down and be simpler, it is good, like trim off all the fat.
And he also says the basic rule of vocabulary is to just use the first word that comes to mind. And I remember when I had started writing articles, it was probably in college, so, oh boy, like 10 years ago now or something, I would try to get clever with words, and it just never works. It really does not.
I mean, well, he makes great points about that. It's like, whatever vocabulary you have, use it, but don't try and pretty yourself up for the sake of prettying yourself up. Because his biggest, I would say, I mean, he talks about a couple like rules, you could call them. His main one being just write a lot and read a lot. Like, he repeats that over and over. It's like, if you're going to be a good writer, you need to be a good reader. You need to be reading a lot. You need to be writing a lot. But the main thrust, I would say, of his argument is like, if you want to be a writer is, and this is very kind of cliche, but it resonates, is he's like, you have to tell the truth.
Yep.
And truth is what he really gets at. He's like, so when you talk about like, oh, if you're trying to go to the thesaurus and find some word that sounds prettier or anything, that's not true. That's not actually you. Like, you're lying in your writing to pretty it up. So I like that his no bullshit approach is not just about form. It's not just about, well, you need to cut this and move this here and yada yada. It's kind of spiritual. He's like, you need to write something that's true. Because if you're writing for money, if you're writing to be popular, if you're writing for the adulation or approval of other people, what you're writing is going to suck. Mm-hmm. Like, you have to be true to yourself. And he's like, and he talks about like, that means, you're going to go to ugly places about yourself. You're going to go to places that you may not like about yourself that comes through in your stories and your characters and stuff. But if that's true, then you need to do it.
Yeah, he definitely focuses on that a lot, and just learning lessons from bad books, because those are going to have more to teach you than something you really love and find to be a good book.
I think that applies. I've used that axiom about film, like, because my primary world is film. And I've for years been saying like, oh, you learn so much more about filmmaking from bad movies than you do good movies. And I was like, oh my God, I was ripping off Stephen King. Like, every time I said that, he says almost word for word that, but applies it to books. Mm-hmm. And it's like, oh yeah, that was a truth that I've carried with me for over a decade. And it came from this book and I didn't even realize it, because it is true. It's like, he gives some wonderful bad examples. His examples are always fun in the book. Yeah. Maybe my favorite treat is him showing a bit of what would eventually be 1408, mm-hmm. as he calls it, the hotel story.
Yeah.
And he's like, here, I will show you exactly what like my first draft and then my edit, going back on the second draft will look like. And it's like, oh, I mean, one, that's a really cool, peek into the process for somebody like Stephen King, and to see like, hey, no, these people that you think of, they don't just like, their works don't emerge perfectly formed like we think they do. They go through, iterations. Like, and I love that in that section where he's showing the 1408 edits, he makes notations for each of the edits, and he says stuff just about like, oh yeah, like I wrote this character and his name was originally like Ostermeyer or Osterman.
Yeah.
And he was like, eventually I knew I was going to have to do the audiobook for this, and I just didn't feel like saying that name over and over again. So I shortened it. It's like, that's great. Like that's such a genuine, like, somebody's like, oh, were you really referencing originally, the famous Nazi war criminal Rudolf Ostermeyer? It's like, no, man, like I wrote that name because that's what came to my brain. And then I didn't, it's like, did you change it for political reasons? Like, no, it was shorter and I was going to have to do the audiobook. I didn't want to say that yeah. name over and over again. I love when Stephen King's kind of blue collar attitude really peeks through. I mean, he's so good at that with his characters and making characters that people feel that they can relate to or are on some level, quote, real to them. And it comes through in his approach to writing too. It's very much, he's not about being super flowery. I love that he will put somebody like H.P. Lovecraft on blast mm-hmm. in the book, being like, look, he's like, love, but he says like, Lovecraft developed this style. That was his style. You'll figure out what your style is. That was very flowery. But then he'll go and be like, in his section about dialogue, he's like, Lovecraft was terrible at dialogue, and I think he knew it. Like, and he just gives this whole big, section of somebody recounting some horrible, I think it's from the color Out of Space. And he's just like, look at that. This is like awful dialogue. It's really refreshing to see that. This is interesting. A point that I wanted to bring up, because you even brought it up when you were talking about kind of his feelings about writing and how it being a lonely job. Do you think that this is a book that could appeal to somebody who has no interest in writing?
I think so, because when I first read this, I was probably still writing articles. But for me now, most of what I do is podcasts and videos. So even though I was already familiar with this book, revisiting it, knowing that I wasn't necessarily like writing anymore, I still, share things I like in a somewhat weekly newsletter. But other than that, for me, I love reading stuff like this and seeing what you can apply to other areas. Like you were saying with the film mention earlier, watching bad films will make you a better filmmaker. And as someone who has watched so many not so great films for this podcast.
I was going to say, yeah, specifically bad. It's like not just bad films, bad Stephen King films.
Yeah. It shows you how someone can take a story that you really love and just not translate it to the screen very well. And reading this, it applies to a lot of things, because if you're working in film, you're still writing. Like when I do videos, if I actually sit down and take the time to script them, I'm still writing.
Oh, sure. I mean, it's it's how we build narratives about many different facets of our lives, and how that applies. And one of the things certainly that I took away, and again, this was another thing where it's like, I didn't realize that this came from on writing. It's just a thing that I kind of, by osmosis took into my own belief system, is when he talks about plot and how much he hates plot. And he talks about the difference between plot and story.
Yep. I highlighted that one too.
Yeah, and it's this thing where it's like, oh my God, again, I've been saying that. There's probably 100 podcast episodes of me talking about like my issues of like plot is a bad thing. And plotting is what makes a lot of bad writing. And I really like his, again, this is a very Stephen King-y vibe to it, where he says, story is honorable and trustworthy. Plot is shifty and best kept under house arrest.
Yeah,
which I love. That
one got me too.
Yeah, it's a great, and when he talks about the differences between plot and story, where and this was certainly when I was doing my most prolific prose writing, this was kind of my Bible. And part of it, what I like is that he talks about, yeah, story happens organically. It comes from the characters. You should have a situation that you kind of go into and have an idea, but you shouldn't. The problem is that he feels with plot, and I agree, is that if you have a plot, then you will manhandle things to adhere to that plot, even if it's at the detriment of the story.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, I've always taken that with me, where it's like, oh yeah, I think up story ideas and premises and situations and stuff, but I love that he talks about like not being somebody who uses outlines. I was like, oh, thank God. Like there's someone, like one of the most prolific popular writers of all times doesn't use outlines, when every writing teacher and every writing thing I ever took was like, you got to have an outline for it. You got to know. It's like, I don't know where this story's going. Like yeah. I have an idea and I have characters, but I kind of want, he talks about, and this is a common writer thing, and I think it rings true with really good writers, is that you come up with these characters and sometimes they get away from you. Like you start being, it's like, no, he makes some example about like he was writing something with some character, and then when he went back and the edit passed, he took it out because he was like, oh, like Sherry would never do that. Like the character that I've come to know, that would not be something she would do. And it's like, oh, that's such a great feeling of like, oh, that's when you feel like these characters have real life in them.
Yeah, and sometimes characters do end up doing things you wouldn't think they would do. And I think as long as you have the characters worked out and you know who they are, that'll come across. And he also had a comment about, the description sort of starts in the writer's mind, but needs to finish with the reader's imagination. So when you are describing places or things, you don't have to describe them down to every little detail.
I love that part because that's something I have always struggled with when I've written prose is like, how much do I need to describe? And he gets to it perfectly where he's like, the only things you need to describe are what are necessary for the scene.
Yeah.
And he's also very much about like, I don't want to see any more like piercing blue eyes and like, cliched stuff like that. He's like, just describe what needs to be said in the scene. And if your writing is correct, the reader will piece it together. And like you said, which is what King said, is like, you need to leave good room for the reader's imagination.
Yeah.
Like he's like, I'm not trying to make my characters look an exact way so that every reader visualizes them the same way. I want them to bring elements of themselves to these characters and to build them in their minds.
And I think that's why when we get adaptations of King's works, we're like, oh, I didn't necessarily picture that character that way, but that's how the filmmaker interpreted it or what have you. It's not like King is going around being like, so this character is 6'3", blonde hair, blue eyes, and describing their entire wardrobe.
Exactly. Yeah. If it doesn't meet this criteria, then it's an incorrect interpretation. Yeah. I mean, like, I love that. One of the things that I took that I had actually forgotten about, and which I think when it comes to, this is less a thing about writing for me, although it does apply, but more so as a reader, something that I like is when he talks about paragraphs. The paragraph section, because this is another thing that I kind of internalized without realizing it came from this book. And he says, I would argue that the paragraph, not the sentence, is the basic unit of writing, the place where coherence begins and words stand a chance of becoming more than mere words. And in this section, he's also talking about formatting, about like, well, when do you decide to break a paragraph and this kind of stuff. And it's some fairly basic stuff that I think a lot of people will actually pick up on if they just read a lot. It's like, oh yeah, you make these particular breaks for dialogue and things like that. But in that section, he gives an example. It's some like two guys talking about another guy. And he shows like why he decided to break the paragraph here, why he kept these things together. And especially for prose writing, that is such an essential thing. And he talks about where he's like, it doesn't mean you have to do it this way. He makes comparisons. It's like, oh, here's this book where it's like, there's a stretch in this book where one paragraph lasts 16 pages. And it's like, but it was, the correct style and format for that particular idea.
Right.
I like that he didn't, one of the things I really like that he didn't get super into is style, because he says like, style is you. It's like, you will figure out what your style is and the things that you will bring to it, but within that you have these tools, which he calls as, the toolbox, the 3-layered toolbox of like the things you need to have at your disposal. So you'll have the right tool when you come up across an issue in your writing. But he doesn't say it's like, well, your style has to be exactly like my style.
Right.
And so I think, my day job, it's like, yeah, I do editing and I do occasionally write, like I'll write film reviews and stuff. And I will think about these things without realizing I'm thinking about them. It's like, okay, how long do I want this paragraph to be? When I look at it, it's like, does this paragraph concisely contain a particular idea or point I'm trying to make, yada, yada. And it's like, oh, this was stuff I picked up being a reader, but also it came from this book and it's just been permanently seated in my brain without me knowing it.
Right. And he also briefly talks about having someone who will read your work. And, he says, first draft, done with the door shut. Don't let anyone in. Don't let them look at it. Don't do any of that. And at the end of the book, or towards the end of the book, he also mentions that a first draft only takes him 3 months for an entire book. So, he's writing pretty much all day. And then he has the open door draft, if you will, where he's done the very sloppy first draft and then he'll, let Tabitha read it. And obviously he has quite a few other people who will read his stuff at this point now. I imagine both of his sons, and he has sent stuff to Richard Chismar, which is how the whole Gwendy's trilogy happened. And it's something that I think a lot of people don't think about because of that quote I mentioned earlier, where it's a lonely job, and having people you can either bounce ideas off of or have them be beta readers, if you will. I think that is something that a lot of people don't consider when they sit down and go, okay, I'm going to write something.
Well, he talks about, I can't remember the exact, I remember the initialism, I believe he uses IR. It's like his, oh gosh, what is it? It's something reader. It's like, it's essentially the intended reader, I think is what he calls it. And he says, it's like, you need to think about like, who is, he's like, writers are writing for themselves and to themselves in some extent, but you should think about like, who is the person that if you gave this to, you would want, and it doesn't even have to necessarily be a real person. For him, it is. He says like, oh, for me, it's Tabitha. Like that she's my first reader, so I think about what she might think when I'm writing something sometimes. But that intended reader does not need to be a real person. It can be just the spectral, like, well, if I put this book out into the world, whose hands do I want it to end up in, and what do I want them to take away from it? There's so much in this book. I really like. I think this book really is possibly the best writing class you could ever get without taking a writing class, which he's very dismissive of in the book, which is funny. It's very, and to some extent, I totally agree with him because having done like acting workshops, and I'm assuming the same applies to like writing workshops and classes and stuff like that, is more often than not, you will get something out of those classes, but it is not the thing that those classes are selling you that you're going to get, where it's like, oh, you'll come out and you'll be an amazing prolific writer, or, oh, you'll be able to have a perfect grasp on, a particular acting method. It's like, no, I learned some things about myself and I made some good friends or connections or something like that. But really, he has a whole big section about like, yeah, you probably don't need to take writing classes. Like, you just need to write. He's like, you need to keep writing and writing and writing and writing and, revising. And at some point, like, if you really adhere to it, you can become a better writer. There's I'm trying to, I didn't have everything written down, but I know there were, the on writing section is just a treasure trove of, just tons of great stuff. And again, like I've said numerous times, things that I've carried with me ever since I've read it and didn't even know I was carrying it with me. And I think the on writing section is really well structured. Every section is like, all right, here's the section on dialogue. All right, here's the section on story. Here's the section on form. Here's the section on grammar. It's and it doesn't read like a textbook. It's very amicable and fun in the Stephen King style. But you're learning, like you're picking stuff up from it as you go along, and it feels. It feels like you're learning something as opposed to it feels like you're learning something as opposed to being like you're being taught something.
Yeah, he's not talking at you necessarily like professors will. And on your note about taking writing classes, I am currently taking Scott Snyder's comic book writing class. And it wasn't necessarily because I want to write comics. At most, I've written like a little 1 to 2 page thing, but it was because of the fact that 1, I enjoy a lot of Scott Snyder's work, and 2, I wanted to learn more about how he makes comics and his way of approaching it, how he handles the storytelling aspect. And that's something I've been digging into lately, is just storytelling in general, whether it's, you look at the way Pixar tells stories or certain authors, even comic book artists are telling this story in their own way. And it's not about, like you said, learning about writing necessarily. And he has like a Discord set up so people are in there collaborating. I'm personally not doing that, but it's more about the community that it builds. And it goes to show you that, yes, you are technically doing this thing on your own. Like, you do a podcast with our friend Travis, and it's like, all right, someone's got to edit this. They're going to be doing it by themselves, So there's always that element of doing something on your own, especially in creative fields, because you're not necessarily going into an office. I know some people do edit podcasts in offices, and I don't know how they do it, but you know what I'm getting at.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I do think there's things to learn from this that go beyond the art of writing prose. And like I say, it's like you taking the Scott Steiner thing, it's similar with Stephen King, where it's like, yeah, I love Stephen King and he's clearly a very effective storyteller for me. I would like to know what kind of goes on in his brain. That may not be the way that necessarily works for me, but it's really more tools in the toolbox. Mm-hmm. Like I think that's the most important thing, is he continuously stresses, like, there is no magic formula. If somebody tells you that there is a formula for writing a good story, they're trying to shake you down. Like, that's not true. Like, and it happens all the time. Like in film, I can't remember how long it was ago, but there was a very famous screenwriting book called Save the Cat.
Yeah. And
it just became like it's like everybody has to write to this formula, and it sucks. Like, it's like, no, there should not, nobody should be telling you that there's one particular formula for creating things. That's kind of counterintuitive to the idea of art and creativity. And I like that King lands on that side of the discussion. He's like, no, here's all the tools you need, and you need to be good at these tools. You need to have well-oiled and maintained tools, like having a good sense of grammar, like having a good sense of how dialogue should work. But these tools are not the whatever the thing is that you're working on. The thing that you're working on is your finished, story, your finished piece of art. But if somebody tells you, like, oh yeah, I can tell you exactly how to make that thing perfectly, they're BSing you. Because from King's perspective, and I tend to agree with it, it's like, no, you just need to continually, learn more things and build up your toolbox. But you don't want your tool, like he even says, like, you don't want your toolbox to be too hefty, because then you can't carry it around with you.
Exactly. And on that screenwriting note too, it's like, okay, yes, there's a specific format you have to follow, but it's no different for books. Like, sure, I guess you could write a brick of a book that doesn't have any chapters, because I think Dolores Claiborne's actually formatted that way. It's just like wall-to-wall text, but you typically still have things like paragraphs and margins, and unless you're reading House of Leaves, things get crazy.
Yeah, anything by Danielewski, yeah, like any of his books.
Yeah, but that's not what he's talking about. He is talking about the way you write a story, not how something needs to be formatted for publishing or for screenwriting. And I think that is one of the biggest takeaways from this book. And I have a few books that I'm going to recommend that are kind of in a similar vein once we're done here. But I really, really do think even if writing isn't your creative field, there's still something to learn from this.
Yeah, I mean, it's still an entertaining book. I mean, we didn't dive too hard into the memoir part. If you have any interest in Stephen King's life, there's some really interesting stuff in here. I mean, him recounting the entire accident was something that's like, oh, like when I got to it, I was like, oh, that's right, that's in this. I'd forgotten that. And it was another one of those, like, oh, I remembered, like, knowing a lot about his accident, but I assumed I just kind of knew that from the news or anything. It's like, oh no, I read it on writing and I'm revisiting it here. And that stuff, it's like, it's terrifying. Mm-hmm. It's really, really scary stuff. And it's real. It's not him trying to be scary. It's like, oh no, like him continually losing consciousness and, trying to remember what he can and being like, maybe that didn't happen. Like maybe that happened later. Somebody else did that. It's like, oh, it comes across like his best writing, extremely real. And, of course it really happened to him, but in the way that he's telling that story, it comes across in an incredibly powerful way. So I think that aspect of the book is certainly worth reading as well. But yeah, I think certainly if you have any interest in creative writing at all, whatever medium you explore it in, I think this is a must read. Mm-hmm. Like, I really think this has tools that you will carry with you, like I have, that I didn't even know I was.
Yeah.
But even still, if you're not interested in creative writing, I think anybody with a creative bone in their body could learn a lot from this. Again, maybe they won't be as interested in about, adverbs. What's bad about adverbs?
Yeah.
What is an adverb? That kind of, maybe they won't care about that. But I think there's a lot here. Again, kind of going back to his main thesis about you have to find the truth. You have to be truthful. And that's going to, require some things that maybe aren't going to be in your toolbox. Like there are things that you're just going to have to discover and experiment with yourself. But at the heart of any really good creative endeavor, no matter what it should be the truth. And the truth is your truth. I've always loved the opening dedication to It, where he says to his kids, like, fiction is the truth inside the lie. And that is like resonated with me so much throughout my life, because I've felt incredibly true things, primarily, a lot of times from fictional endeavors. It's like there are truths about the world that I've seen and experienced through fiction that if you just told me that, or, I read it in a textbook or something, it wouldn't have impacted me the way it did. And you can peek behind the curtain a bit with that, as far as Stephen King's concerned, if you read On Writing, which I thoroughly recommend. But yeah, I mean, if you've got some other recommendations as well, I would love to hear those.
Yeah, and I will say one last thing. This is one of my favorite things he has written. The first time I read it, I was like, I love this. And going back and revisiting it was such a treat. But I wanted to recommend 3 books from Austin Kleon. And he wrote this series of books. So the first one is Steal Like an Artist, 10 Things Nobody Told You About Being Creative. The second one is Show Your Work, 10 Ways to Share Your Creativity and Get Discovered. And then the most recent one is Keep Going, 10 Ways to Stay Creative in Good Times and Bad. And they're these adorable little square books, and you could knock them out in, honestly, like 2 hours tops. Like they're very digestible, cool. Which, kind of like On Writing is, in Stephen King terms at least. And it makes it so easy to just want to revisit them. Like I was debating on doing that after reading this again, because I was like, you know what, maybe it's time for, a little extra motivation.
Oh, sure. I mean, part of the reason I wanted to do this particular episode is that it has happened, is like after reading him, it's like, yeah, I have that creative juice. It's like I continually think of my whole life. I've had ideas for stories, whatever form they would be in is sometimes unclear. It's like, well, do I see it as a movie, as a short film, as a short story, as a novel? I have all of these ideas, but what he says really rings true, where it's like you want to be good at writing or good at what your creative endeavor is. You just have to do it, and you have to do it a lot, and you have to, be writing bad poetry, which he talks about in here, in his memoir section. It's like, oh, he's taking some college class and we were having to write poems and stuff. And later he revisits that and says, like, yeah, maybe I should be writing more bad poetry.
Yep.
Because like that is it's the thing that gets the gears moving. And I love that he stresses that continuously, where he's like, you have to write a lot, and you're going to write a lot of bad stuff, and that's okay, because you'll get better. If you really stick to it, and if you really stay true to yourself, and if you use these tools that I've tried to give you, you will become a better writer. And he's very blunt, where he's like, you cannot turn a bad writer into a good writer.
Yeah.
he's like, you can turn a competent one into a better writer. And he's like, I really think that if you use these tools, he's like, you already know if you're a competent writer, if you have some grasp on what you want to do. If you want to be a better writer, use these tools and keep them around. But the journey's still something you have to take. And he stresses that very, very strongly. And it was like, yeah, it's like I started thinking about a whole bunch of my old short story ideas that I haven't thought of in a long time and all that kind of stuff. It's like, yeah, I really think this is a great... Hearing you say that it's like one of your absolute favorite Stephen King things makes me absolutely overjoyed that I got to be on this episode, as opposed to like another Children of the Corn or something. But
hey, you might be back for another. Children of the Corn.
I have been the one who has said it's like, well, look, if it has to be done, I've already done 2 of them, so I'm kind of pot committed at this point. Yeah. And my completionist nature will be like, yeah, at least I'll get to go to my grave saying I've seen every Children of the Corn movie.
Well, I don't know if we'll go that far, Drew, but
yeah. but no, I can't recommend this book enough. The version I had, I think under like 240 pages. Like it's a super short, easy, digestible read. It's incredibly informative without feeling like, you're in school. It's entertaining. It's funny. It's got his sense of drama. It's a good peek. I love the little peeks behind certain books because he'll tell you stuff. It's like, oh, well, I had this issue in The Stand. Like, and he goes into, it's like, I had a story issue where I was like, I don't know what the hell I'm going to do. And I almost abandoned the book. And then this is the way that I came. It's like, oh, that's always like cool, behind the scenes trivia stuff. So you'll learn that too. It's for as short as it is, it's kind of overflowing with knowledge and talent and stuff that I think like anyone can take with them going forward in whatever creative endeavor they decide to pursue.
Yeah, and quick correction, because I cannot read or do math, apparently. I have the 20th anniversary edition. It has not been 30 years, but still.
Okay, I was like, oh man, if it's 30, I feel really old. Like, is it really? Okay, yeah, 20. That tracks a little bit more because it came out like
1999 or 2000.
Well, yeah, I was gonna say I want to say it's like 1999 or 2000 because his accident was in 97, I think.
Yeah, no, I do a Stephen King podcast and I cannot read. It's fine.
That's okay. You've read far more Stephen King than a lot of people had, so. It's okay for you to get blurry vision from time to time.
Look, the cover is very small on my Kindle homepage, okay?
Yes, yeah. I'm as a lifelong glasses wearer, I have nothing but empathy and sympathy for you. But no, yeah, if I was going to make like a top 5 Stephen King books you must read, On Writing would absolutely be on there. And next to all of his fiction and everything, I'd be like, read this. This is one of the best things, like you said. It's one of the best things he's ever written, not just because it's like, oh, cool, it's a Stephen King telling you how to be a good writer. It's like, no, it's entertaining. It's simple. Like, there will be things in here I think some people will struggle with if they have no kind of grasp on writing or fiction or prose or anything. Like, but for the most part, he presents these ideas very, very digestibly. And entertainingly, like in a prose story format. So yeah, I just can't say enough good things about this book. It really is one of the absolute cornerstones of my life in terms of how I approach, not just writing, not just reading, but all my entire relationship with fiction. Mm-hmm. So in that regard, you can't get much higher praise than that. So
yeah, we'll end it on that note. So thank you so much, Drew, for coming on to finally talk about a book that wasn't a short story collection.
No, thank you. I'm very stoked that I got to be on this one. If, like I said, if there was one that I could have carved away and been like, no, like I don't want anybody else to get this one, it would have been this. So thank you so much for having me, Deanna.
Of course, and you'll be back on for either Children of the Corn, more Patreon episodes. Who knows what's next?
Oh yeah, I'll pop up. Don't you worry. I love doing these and look forward to the next one.